The abandoned city of Kalam sits like a forgotten dream in the mountains of northern Pakistan, its empty streets whispering secrets that most of the world will never hear. What happened here wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't some ancient civilization that crumbled over centuries. This was a thriving tourist destination just 15 years ago, filled with families, children playing in the streets, and the sound of life echoing through the valley. But if you walked through Kalam today, you'd find something that would chill you to the bone. Houses stand empty with their doors hanging open like silent screams. Schools sit abandoned with children's drawings still pinned to classroom walls. The local mosque, once the heart of the community, now serves as a monument to a disaster that changed everything. I'm about to take you inside one of Pakistan's most haunting stories, and I need to warn you right now that what you're going to discover will challenge everything you think you know about natural disasters and human resilience. This isn't just another documentary about a flood. This is the story of how an entire civilization can vanish almost overnight, and why the world chose to look the other way. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand exactly how a paradise became a graveyard, and more importantly, you'll discover the terrifying truth about what's still lurking beneath the surface of this so-called recovery. Because here's what nobody wants to tell you about Kalam. The disaster that destroyed this place didn't end when the waters receded. It's still happening right now. Let me paint you a picture of what Kalam used to be. Imagine waking up every morning to the sound of crystal-clear rivers flowing through your backyard. Picture yourself stepping outside to see snow-capped peaks stretching endlessly across the horizon, their reflection dancing on pristine lake surfaces that look like they belonged in a fairy tale. This wasn't some remote wilderness that only hardcore adventurers could reach. Families from across Pakistan would make the journey here every summer, filling the local hotels, buying handmade crafts from village artisans, and creating memories that would last a lifetime. The valley buzzed with the energy of a community that had found the perfect balance between preserving their ancient culture and welcoming the modern world. Children here grew up speaking multiple languages because tourists came from everywhere. Local guides could take you on treks that would make your Instagram followers weep with envy. The air was so clean that visitors from Karachi and Lahore would joke about getting dizzy from actually breathing pure oxygen for once in their lives. But underneath this postcard-perfect surface, something was building. Something that the locals could feel in their bones, but couldn't quite articulate. The old-timers would talk about changes in the weather patterns, how the monsoons felt different, how the glaciers seemed to be acting strangely. Most people dismiss these concerns as the worried mumblings of an older generation that always thinks the world is ending. They were wrong to dismiss those warnings. July 2010 started like any other summer in Kalam. Hotels were booked solid. Families were arriving daily for their annual vacations. Tour guides were leading groups up the mountain trails. Everything seemed perfectly normal until the morning when the sky turned an unnatural shade of gray that nobody had ever seen before. What happened next wasn't just rain. It was as if the heavens themselves had decided to empty every drop of water they'd been holding back for decades, all at once, directly onto this small valley. But here's the thing that makes this story so much more terrifying than your typical flood narrative. This wasn't just about too much water falling from the sky. The real horror began when people realized that the rivers weren't just overflowing, they were changing course entirely. Ancient waterways that had flowed in the same direction for thousands of years suddenly decided to carve new paths through the heart of the community. Imagine watching your neighborhood creek turn into a raging torrent that's now flowing directly through your living room. Within hours, roads that had taken decades to build were simply gone. Not damaged, not cracked, but completely erased, as if they had never existed. The main bridge that connected Kalam to the outside world didn't collapse dramatically like you see in movies. It just quietly disappeared under a wall of water and debris, cutting off the entire valley from any hope of rescue or escape. But the most haunting part of this disaster wasn't the immediate destruction. It was watching a community that had survived for generations slowly come to the realization that everything they had built, everything they had worked for, everything that defined their identity as a people, was being systematically erased by forces completely beyond their control. Families who had lived in the same houses for generations watched their homes get swallowed by landslides that seemed to target the most historically significant buildings first. The old marketplace where generations had gathered to trade and socialize vanished overnight. Even the cemetery where their ancestors were buried got washed away, leaving families without even the comfort of knowing where their loved ones were laid to rest. What makes the Kalam disaster unique in the world of natural catastrophes is how quickly a thriving community became a ghost town. Most post-disaster areas see gradual population decline over months or years. Kalam emptied in a matter of days. People didn't just lose their homes. They lost their entire way of life so completely that many couldn't even imagine how to begin rebuilding. The government response was swift and well-intentioned, at least on paper. Officials arrived with promises of reconstruction funds, temporary housing, and plans to rebuild the valley better than before. Relief supplies poured in from across the country. International aid organizations set up operations. For a few months, it looked like Kalam might actually rise from the ashes stronger than ever. That's when the real tragedy began to unfold. Reconstruction efforts started with great fanfare, but within the first year, locals began noticing that the new buildings weren't being constructed in the places where the old community had thrived. Instead, developers seemed more interested in areas that would be accessible to outside investors, rather than serving the needs of the original population. The new roads didn't connect the traditional neighborhoods. The new schools were built in locations that made sense on government maps, but ignored how families actually lived and moved through their community. Most devastating of all, the new economic development plans seemed designed to attract tourism revenue, rather than supporting the local industries that had sustained families for generations. Slowly, the people who had called Kalam home for their entire lives began to realize that the reconstruction wasn't really about rebuilding their community. It was about creating something entirely new on top of the ruins of what they had lost. Something that looked good in government reports and international aid assessments, but felt foreign and unwelcoming to the people it was supposedly designed to help. This is where our story takes a turn that most disaster documentaries never explore. Because what happened to the original residents of Kalam after the cameras stopped rolling and the aid workers moved on to the next crisis reveals something deeply disturbing about how our world really responds to human suffering. The families who couldn't adapt to the new version of their hometown didn't just move away quietly. They scattered across Pakistan like refugees in their own country, carrying with them stories that challenge every assumption we make about disaster recovery and community resilience. These displaced families found themselves in a situation that nobody talks about when disaster strikes. They weren't just homeless. They were culturally homeless. Imagine trying to explain to your children why the place where their grandparents are buried no longer exists. Imagine trying to maintain traditions and customs that were specifically tied to a landscape that has been fundamentally altered beyond recognition. The psychological trauma of losing not just your home, but your entire sense of place creates wounds that never fully heal. These families didn't just need new houses. They needed to reconstruct their entire identity as a people. And that's something no government relief program or international aid package is designed to address. What's even more heartbreaking is how quickly the outside world forgot about Kalam once the immediate crisis passed. The media moved on to newer disasters. The aid organizations redirected their resources to more recent emergencies. The government officials who had made passionate speeches about rebuilding found other priorities that demanded their attention. But here's where this story gets really dark. While everyone was focused on the visible destruction and the obvious need for immediate relief, something else was happening beneath the surface that would have long-term consequences far more devastating than the original flood. The disaster had fundamentally changed the geology of the entire region. The massive water flows and landslides hadn't just damaged existing structures. They had destabilized the entire mountain ecosystem in ways that wouldn't become apparent for years. Underground water systems had been permanently altered. Soil composition had changed. Even the local climate patterns had shifted in subtle but significant ways. What this meant was that even if the community had been perfectly rebuilt exactly as it was before, it wouldn't have been sustainable in the new environmental reality. The land that had supported generations of families was no longer capable of supporting the same population in the same way. But nobody wanted to acknowledge this inconvenient truth because it made the reconstruction effort seem pointless. So instead of having honest conversations about what was actually possible in the new Kalam, everyone pretended that things could go back to normal if they just tried hard enough and spent enough money. This created a situation where resources were wasted on projects doomed to fail, while the real needs of the displaced population were ignored. The few families who did attempt to return to the reconstructed Kalam found themselves living in a place that looked superficially similar to their old home, but felt completely alien. The new buildings might have been more modern and better designed, but they weren't connected to the social and cultural networks that had made the original community function. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades found themselves scattered across different areas of the rebuilt town. Traditional gathering places had been replaced with modern facilities that served the same theoretical function, but didn't carry the emotional and historical significance of the original spaces. It was like trying to rebuild a family by getting new people with the same names. The economic foundation of the community had been equally disrupted. The tourism industry that had provided income for so many families was rebuilt around different assumptions about what visitors wanted to see and experience. Instead of authentic cultural exchanges between locals and travelers, the new tourism model focused on package deals and standardized experiences that could be delivered efficiently, but lacked the personal connections that had made Kalam special. Local artisans found that there was no longer demand for their traditional crafts because the new tourism infrastructure was designed around souvenir shops selling mass-produced items. Guides who had spent their lives learning every trail and story in the mountains discovered that tour companies preferred younger guides who could follow predetermined routes and scripts. Even the agricultural practices that had sustained families for generations became impossible to maintain. The changed soil conditions and water patterns meant that traditional crops either wouldn't grow or required expensive inputs that most families couldn't afford. The knowledge that elders had accumulated over decades about how to work with the land became irrelevant overnight. This is where the story of Kalam intersects with a much larger global crisis that most people don't even realize is happening. Around the world, climate change and extreme weather events are creating situations where entire communities are being forced to choose between maintaining their cultural identity and adapting to new environmental realities. The families displaced from Kalam weren't just victims of a single flood. They were early casualties of a global transformation that's going to affect millions of people over the coming decades. Their experience offers a preview of what happens when our assumptions about stability and permanence collide with the reality of rapid environmental change. What makes their story particularly tragic is how preventable much of their suffering was. Not the original disaster itself, but the social and cultural devastation that followed. With better planning and more honest assessment of what was actually possible, the reconstruction efforts could have focused on helping people adapt to their new reality, instead of trying to recreate something that was no longer viable. But that would have required admitting that some losses can't be reversed, and that sometimes the most compassionate response to disaster is helping people build new lives rather than trying to restore old ones. It would have meant having conversations about grief and acceptance that nobody was prepared to have. Instead, the official narrative remained focused on triumph over adversity and the resilience of the human spirit. While those themes make for inspiring speeches and feel-good news stories, they don't help families figure out how to maintain their sense of identity and community when the physical and social foundations of their lives have been permanently altered. The children who grew up in the years after the Kalam disaster represent perhaps the most profound loss of all. They're growing up without access to the cultural knowledge and practices that had been passed down through generations. They're learning to see their heritage as something that belongs to the past, rather than something that can evolve and adapt to new circumstances. These young people are caught between worlds in a way that their parents never had to experience. They remember fragments of the old Kalam from family stories and faded photographs, but they're building their adult lives in places that bear no resemblance to the community their families called home for centuries. They speak the same language as their grandparents, but they're missing the cultural context that gave that language its deeper meaning. The traditional songs that used to mark seasonal celebrations don't make sense when you're living in an urban apartment complex. The stories about specific mountains and valleys become abstract when those landmarks are either gone or transformed beyond recognition. Even simple things like cooking techniques that were developed around local ingredients become impossible to maintain when those ingredients are no longer available. This cultural erosion happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, which makes it even more devastating. Families don't wake up one morning and realize they've lost their heritage. Instead, they notice small changes over months and years. A traditional recipe gets modified because certain spices aren't available. A festival gets celebrated differently because the original location no longer exists. A craft technique gets simplified because the proper materials are too expensive or hard to find. Each individual change seems minor and reasonable, but collectively, they represent the systematic dismantling of a way of life that had evolved over centuries to be perfectly adapted to a specific place and environment. The people of Kalam didn't just lose their homes in the flood. They lost their entire cultural ecosystem, and there's no reconstruction program that can restore something that complex. What's happening to the scattered families of Kalam is a form of cultural extinction that's happening in slow motion. Unlike the dramatic disappearance of languages or the obvious destruction of historical sites, this kind of loss is subtle enough that it doesn't make headlines or trigger international concern. But for the people experiencing it, the impact is just as profound as any other form of genocide. The most heartbreaking aspect of this cultural dissolution is how it affects the relationships between generations within families. Grandparents who survived the disaster find themselves unable to pass on knowledge that they spent their entire lives accumulating. Their expertise about reading weather patterns, understanding seasonal cycles, or maintaining traditional crafts becomes irrelevant in their new urban environments. Meanwhile, grandchildren growing up in these displaced communities develop skills and interests that their elders can't relate to or support. The natural mentorship relationships that had sustained families for generations break down because the context that made those relationships meaningful no longer exist. Families that had been tightly knit for centuries find themselves growing apart simply because they no longer share a common frame of reference for understanding the world. The economic implications of this cultural breakdown extend far beyond the immediate families involved. The traditional knowledge systems that had been developed in places like Kalam represent centuries of accumulated wisdom about sustainable living practices, environmental management, and community organization. When these systems disappear, humanity loses valuable insights that could be crucial for addressing contemporary challenges. The farming techniques that had been perfected in the Kalam Valley weren't just local curiosities. They represented sophisticated approaches to working with challenging mountain environments that could potentially be adapted to help other communities facing similar geographical challenges. The social structures that had allowed the community to thrive for so long contained lessons about cooperation and resource sharing that could inform modern efforts to build more resilient communities. But because the displacement happened so quickly and completely, there was no systematic effort to document or preserve these knowledge systems before they disappeared. The focus was entirely on immediate physical needs like shelter, food, and medical care. Nobody thought to prioritize the preservation of intangible cultural assets until it was too late to capture them effectively. This represents a massive failure of imagination on the part of relief organizations and government agencies. They approached the Kalam disaster as if it were simply a matter of replacing damaged infrastructure and relocating displaced people. They didn't recognize that they were dealing with the potential extinction of an entire way of life that had unique value not just for the people directly involved, but for humanity as a whole. The international development community has protocols for protecting endangered species and preserving historical artifacts, but there's no equivalent framework for protecting endangered cultures during disaster response. When a community like Kalam gets scattered, the assumption is that the people will naturally adapt to new circumstances and that any cultural losses are an unfortunate but acceptable cost of survival. This assumption reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what culture actually is and how it functions. Culture isn't just a collection of traditions and practices that people can choose to maintain or abandon based on convenience. It's an integrated system of meaning-making that provides people with their basic sense of identity and belonging in the world. When that system gets disrupted as completely as it did for the people of Kalam, the psychological and social consequences can be more devastating than the original physical disaster. People don't just lose their homes and possessions. They lose their sense of who they are and where they belong in the larger scheme of human existence. The mental health impacts of this kind of cultural displacement are still being documented by researchers. But early findings suggest that the trauma is unlike anything that traditional disaster counseling programs are designed to address. Standard approaches to post-disaster mental health support focus on helping people process specific traumatic events and develop coping strategies for returning to normal life. But what happens when there's no normal life to return to? What happens when the entire framework that previously gave someone's existence meaning and purpose has been permanently destroyed? These are questions that the mental health profession is only beginning to grapple with as climate-related displacement becomes more common around the world. The few families from Kalam who have managed to maintain some connection to their cultural roots have done so through extraordinary personal effort and sacrifice. They've created informal networks with other displaced families to share resources, preserve traditions, and support each other through the ongoing process of cultural adaptation. These grassroots preservation efforts operate without any official support or recognition. Families pool their limited resources to organize occasional gatherings where they can speak their traditional language, share traditional foods, and teach their children songs and stories from the old community. But these efforts are fragile and constantly threatened by the practical demands of survival in their new environments. The children who participate in these cultural preservation activities often find themselves torn between their families' efforts to maintain traditional ways and the pressure to assimilate into mainstream Pakistani society. They understand that their parents and grandparents are trying to preserve something important, but they also recognize that maintaining these connections makes it harder for them to succeed in their new social and economic circumstances. This creates an impossible choice that no child should have to make. Do they honor their heritage and risk limiting their future opportunities? Or do they embrace assimilation and risk losing connection to their family's history and identity? Either choice involves significant losses that will affect them for the rest of their lives. The tragedy is that this choice is entirely artificial. There's no inherent reason why preserving cultural heritage and adapting to new circumstances have to be mutually exclusive. Other societies have successfully maintained their cultural identity while adapting to dramatic changes in their physical and social environment. But that requires institutional support and social recognition that simply isn't available to the displaced families of Kalam. What they need is a framework that treats cultural preservation as an essential component of disaster recovery, rather than a luxury that can be addressed after more pressing needs have been met. They need educational programs that help their children understand their heritage as a source of strength and wisdom, rather than a burden that holds them back. They need economic opportunities that build on their traditional skills, rather than requiring them to abandon everything they know how to do well. Most importantly, they need recognition that their losses represent not just personal tragedies, but collective losses for all of humanity. The wisdom, knowledge, and cultural practices that disappeared with old Kalam contained insights that could potentially benefit people around the world who are facing similar challenges. But instead of treating this cultural extinction as the crisis that it actually is, the broader world has simply moved on to other concerns. The displaced families of Kalam have been left to figure out how to preserve what they can of their heritage, while simultaneously adapting to circumstances that their ancestors could never have imagined. This abandonment represents a fundamental failure of our global systems for protecting human dignity and cultural diversity. We've created elaborate international frameworks for protecting economic interests and political stability, but we have no equivalent mechanisms for protecting the cultural foundations that give human life meaning and purpose. The story of Kalam's cultural extinction is being repeated in communities around the world as climate change, economic development, and political instability force people to abandon the places where their families have lived for generations. Each of these losses represents not just personal tragedy for the families involved, but an irreplaceable loss of human knowledge and wisdom. Yet these losses remain largely invisible to the broader world because they happen gradually and don't fit neatly into our existing categories for understanding disaster and recovery. We know how to measure physical destruction and economic loss, but we have no metrics for measuring the destruction of meaning-making systems that have sustained communities for centuries. This invisibility ensures that the same mistakes will be repeated over and over again as more communities face displacement and cultural extinction, until we develop better ways of recognizing and responding to cultural losses during disasters. We'll continue to treat symptoms while ignoring the deeper wounds that prevent communities from truly recovering. The abandoned ruins of present-day Kalam stand as a monument, not just to the power of natural forces, but to our collective failure to understand what recovery really means for communities whose entire way of life has been destroyed. So when you visit the ruins of Kalam today, remember that you're not just looking at the aftermath of a flood. You're witnessing the systematic erasure of an entire way of life that the world chose to forget. Those empty buildings aren't just abandoned structures. They're tombstones, marking the death of a culture that had survived for centuries until we failed to protect it when it mattered most. The real tragedy isn't that disasters happen. It's that we've built a world that treats cultural extinction as acceptable collateral damage. We've created systems that can mobilize billions of dollars to rebuild roads and bridges, but can't find the resources to preserve the knowledge and traditions that make communities worth saving in the first place. The scattered families of Kalam are still out there, still fighting to maintain pieces of their heritage while adapting to a world that doesn't value what they've lost. Their struggle represents our collective failure to understand that true recovery means more than just replacing what was destroyed. It means preserving what makes us human. As climate change forces more communities to face similar choices, the question isn't whether we can prevent these disasters. The question is whether we'll finally learn to protect the things that matter most when disaster strikes. Because if we don't, places like Kalam will keep disappearing until we've lost something we can never get back.